Anyway, so I'm going to start chipping away at the Patrick Bet-David discussion on capitalism and capitalism and communism. And I will put this commentary as linked to the video on my various social media pages where I share this stuff. And so I kept putting this off. I just kind of wanted to, I guess, make it more of an official response or something. But I think I'm just going to chat through it, just like I did with some of the other videos, commenting on various topics. I think the other one was like socialism and capitalism. And so once again, my concession is that, or at least my difference, I guess you would say, in these socialist, communism, capitalism discussions is that I don't look at it as needing to do away with private property in that sense, in relation to various negotiations within capitalism and communism or socialism. And so anyway, this is just in addition to some of those other conversations. I do tend to think, though, that there probably is different ways to look at how people are viewing private property and whatnot, and in relation to how various assets are transferred or held in some type of official standard or shared standard or legal standard. But anyway, for right now, I'm not going to get into that's just kind of benchmarked. It's bookmarked in the back of my mind as to eventually getting into more of what is meant by the idea of private property. In general, though, it seems, to put it simply, some of the issue with systems, some versions of systems based on capitalism and private property, seem to have to do with systemic closures by which the mechanisms for private property and the governing apparatus that supported it had certain measures attached to it that would select between some in-groups and out-groups, functionally then creating systemic enclosures or obstacles for some groups to be able to be incorporated into the system properly. I tend to think at some level, and so I'm trying not to get too much into my own personal discussing on this because I want to just go into replying to the themes brought up in the conversation with the Patrick Bet-David in conversation that he's having with those defending communism. But anyway, I do tend to think it's interesting to look at times when the system would create certain enclosures and select for certain types of various ones in the population to then select for conditions by which various ones can obtain private property rights. And if you're not within those systems, then it can functionally behave as a type of enclosure system. And so I think throughout history, there's various types of weaponized enclosures of systems. And so when it gets to that point, it then reemerges as the question of what type of closure, what type of advocacy to relieve from those types of enclosures, what standard is there to have more of a longevity in terms of looking at private property in relation to a functional long-term system and whatnot. Anyway, so just saying there's questions that have to do with the type or the form or the connections attached to private property by which people develop their worldview in relation to how they perceive capitalism and what it selects for and what it sets in motion. Anyway, though, so one of the first questions that Patrick starts off with is, well, hold on, let me get the title of the video. The Patrick Bet-David discussion appears to be, so I'm making reference to the YouTube video, and it seems that it is hosted by or on the Surrounded platform, titled Surrounded, and it's titled One Capitalist versus 20 Anti-Capitalists, featuring Patrick Bet-David. Okay, so the first claim that he makes is that incentive is the engine of capitalism. He seems to be arguing that basically what it also seems to suggest is that what he's opposing, whether it be communism or whatnot, is that it doesn't incentivize people to be motivated to try harder or to change their life, or et cetera, et cetera. And so some of the responses to this is basically saying they don't believe that that's true. There's a lot of different types of motivation or what incentivizes people to do things, and it doesn't just come from capitalism. And so then it kind of goes into various examples. You've heard this before, where certain ones within like the capitalistic or kind of economic domain will seem to suggest that it's a more favorable system because of this, because of it selects for people that are motivated, that are incentivized to want to make change, and then it empowers them to be able to have a system by which they can make those changes and then benefit from those changes and whatnot. I'm not saying that never happens, but there also could be ways by which the actual benefit that is being produced can also potentially then be produced if there are certain measures within the standard of mechanisms based on, say, private property or whatnot, that could be even more free, that don't have to select for, like you find within history where it selects for certain types of families. Not that we're against family, not that, there aren't some good measures that it tries to select for. But so this kind of goes into what I was getting to, though. At some level, there seems to need to be universal values within it, not necessarily selecting for, to go even farther than what we've seen within capitalism. You see a lot of capitalists argue for this sense of preserving the gains of capitalism within selecting for these certain viewpoints of family and whatnot. You find, though, the history attached to that. I mean, it sounds all well and good, but this is why, in a simple form, I tend to think there seems to be something more to, if you even look at scripture, it makes reference to your personal value, that there's something that shifts in relation to the personal to the collective, the personal unto selecting for these other mechanisms and whatnot of change and growth. And then from there, you trust in faith that the love that you have and whatnot still functions within those types of selecting for the incorporation of love and whatnot, but that you don't have to put it in a system to enforce types of the family. So like I was saying, even though it sounds all well and good, like, hey, let's implement in the system the selecting for these types of preservations, it seems to over time then get in the way of what could be more of a continuous freedom, potentially, because you have to, if you're trying to select for a system that taps into continuing along the growth of people, at some level there has to be that selecting for the personal value to the trust of what love would trust, I guess. And if you create within a system selecting for the preservation of something that doesn't require it to be a function eventually of being freed to be held together in love, then eventually it can become an enclosed version of a system. That's what it seems like. And you kind of see these accounts within history where different forms of groups will implement in their standard of governing selecting to favor their group and to favor some kind of value. Even if it sounds good at the time, it outgrows that. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into those details. But anyway, I'm just saying it does seem like at some level, the way that some people have formulated capitalism, they're selecting for a system that eventually causes various forms of enclosures against what love could otherwise connect to. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because he does give examples. So they start off with examples of, say, like a single mother or somebody working multiple jobs, and then he does kind of say, well, at some level, it's, he kind of infers that it's some of their choices and whatnot. And then it kind of gets into these discussions as to, at some level, it could be some of their choices, but at the same time, there are certain functions and factors that influence or limit their choice and whatnot. He then goes into, explaining that he knows what that experience is. He comes from a single mother. His parents separated. They went through contention and da-da-da-da. So he does explain that he understands those experiences, but that for him, he basically was motivated to want to change his life and whatnot. If you look at it from that standpoint, a lot of times what happens there is that, yes, it could be a variety of people's choices, whether you're married or single or divorced or whatever. There's numerous examples of people's unique situations. And of course, at some level, there is something to do with people's choices and motivation and whatnot. But there's also this other factor, though, of no matter how much you try to make the better choices or make the responsible choices or appeal to situations where you hope for and you create conditions to bring out the betterment of various ones involved, at some level, people involved are not always going to make those choices, right? And what you also can find is even if you do try to make the most moral choice and selecting for various disciplines unto your life, the system doesn't always favor that. The system of which we find ourselves in does not always favor that. And so at some level, what it also seems as to what's going on there is what he become at some level in these conditions, in some mechanisms that are involved in capitalism become a useful recruiting method. Mechanisms that are built into it that function as certain levels of enclosures are motivating people to be recruited into these practices and into these various approaches because they reward those that would adhere to those forms of approach. In and of itself, like through my own experience, the system doesn't simply just reward good behavior or discipline or, like playing by the rules or some of these other factors or good work ethic or commitment. It also depends on various acceptance of who already, like in a sense, like if you are going to allow yourself to be recruited into the other ideals by which reinforce the system. And in that sense, I could see the appeal of saying to gain the acceptance of the system and the benefits of the system, there is a type of motivating factor there because it demotivates. In some levels, it doesn't always favor what is true or what is like good work ethic on its own or possible contribution to society as much as what is sellable at some level, and who would be motivated to enter into a certain type of sellability and whatnot. And anyway, there's more to say there. I'm kind of rambling too much on this point. I think it'll kind of get into other topics as we go farther into the questions. That's not to say, though, just like another note, like quick note on this topic. That's not to say that I don't think that some people or that people can't build success from the system and kind of counter some of the other choices and strategize and still build like pretty decent structures through various types of capitalistic interaction and strategy and whatnot. And I also would admit, though, that even within the system, there are ways that there are aspects where you even if the market in an excessive kind of way doesn't always favor, or it's not always sellable to speak on various things. Well, we kind of live in a peculiar time at this point, and I guess I just kind of have to say it plainly, is like some stuff that is actually very sellable, marketable. We just have forces that that just don't want to accept or allow the market to do its thing. So maybe that's a whole other question, is what are the blockages within capitalism, various investments and whatnot that function to actually block the mechanism of what it otherwise should be. So I don't know if that's like a whole other question there. In the midst of it, though, at least there are some measures where if you do kind of strategize some of your assets and whatnot, you can at least have some level of building some sense of stability through some of the mechanisms of, maybe strategizing property and stuff like that. But some of that also is because people have implemented other pathways of safety net and support for people. So I don't know. So anyway, I feel like I'm getting too rambly on this one. And so I'm still going to just kind of wait on other parts of the discussion. Patrick then kind of goes into the question of, various ones lining up to get into America and whatnot. This isn't to say that America doesn't have some great aspects of, like that would be attractive to people. And there's a lot of good things about America. But in the sense of looking at the economic effects on the world stage, I mean, America also plays a role in kind of laying the standard of the precedent for what kind of goes on and what are the ripple effects among other nations in the world. And so to be a part of that ongoing conversation and to advocate for how other nations are affected, then it draws people here to be able to advocate on behalf of their countries. You usually don't see people come here and then lose interest in advocating for their countries for the most part. And because of, one aspect of that seems to be because it also has influence over framing the way that world conversations can go. I mean, Patrick then kind of makes reference to other countries, what about South Korea or North Korea or what have you, and the freedom to speak and to share and to argue your points. And at some level, okay, you can say that. But what we're also finding in America is there still are filters on what you can say, how you can say it. And we're not entirely free to say some of the things that are, shifting toward truth and advocacy for freedoms and standards of freedom for people. And so we're starting to find that does seem to be an effect lingering within some of the otherwise better portions of the U.S. There's these other aspects of things that we're not allowed to say. And so that's kind of a blind spot to make reference to other countries where you're not free to speak on things, but not seeing that effect in the selective systems that we live in as well. Patrick then makes reference to funding their ability to go to any communist country and renounce their citizenship to the U.S. I think, and maybe he would change. Maybe he's kind of shifting his viewpoint on seeing things in recent events. But I think what's, I've heard a lot of different groups that argue for like Western development, and even though there's some good things about Western development, all of these things are infiltrated with other types of coercive approaches, like infiltrated within them. But I've heard that, you hear that all the time when people say, then why don't you just leave the U.S. or why don't you go to this country or that country, da 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 da. Why don't you go to these communist countries? But at some level, what you find is geopolitically, the world is connected into reactionary type gridlock of economic forces. And so at some level, it's there's this sense where if you're talking about advocating for the economy, it also coincides with advocating for better measures and behaviors and responses toward other nations. And so it is, in a sense, seeking to advocate for better human rights and an improvement of relations. And so at some level, it's kind of like saying, hey, this economic battle that we've waged against these other countries, whether it be Cuba or, et cetera, like the examples that he's given, how about you just go there? And it's like, well, you can't just utilize the position of the U.S. as a powerful entity that sanctions and affects what otherwise might be a more freer form of their economic approach, and then intentionally make that economic relationship more difficult. And then if people try to advocate and say, hey, how about let's improve that dynamic, and then say, well, why don't you just go there then? It just seems like a skewed way of framing the situation, of saying, actually, why don't you improve the conditions so that you don't have this control mechanism by which then you place these improper pressures on various ones. And in a lot of ways, a lot of these other interactions are inescapable from effects or responses to these other political approaches, right? So you find a direct connection between other nations' responses in relation to control mechanisms that we see and that people are trying to advocate in the U.S. to improve and keep refining the good of what America is through other growth mechanisms and relational improvements and economic improvements. And so I just don't see the proper framing of that, as saying, well, if it's so much better there, why don't you go there? Like, you hear that usually is a type of language that people have when they're not really seeing kind of like the nuance between interactions and influences, and when people are kind of in the tension trying to advocate for improvements. And, it'd kind of be as though somebody says, hey, there's a war zone over here and you have the power to like minimize and diffuse the situation. And someone refuses and says, well, I'm not going to. Don't you think that it's, don't you think we're correct? And then you'd say, well, I think that you should diffuse the situation and, seek for ways to correct for any type of like interaction that could be improved there. And then if someone refuses and then they say, well, why don't you just go there? And it's like, well, how about in a world where you're not inflicting these types of ripple effects on other places? And in that type of worldview, maybe people would go there. But the economic forces are making it intentionally difficult to have more successful approaches among other groups intentionally built into their economic approach. It then goes into, still within the idea of motivation or incentive within capitalism, it goes into the topic of healthcare, which that's a whole other topic on its own. And so he kind of makes mention of, should a motivation for profit not be incorporated or of influence within health, like healthcare and whatnot. And so they kind of just talk about there's other motivations for healthcare and quality healthcare research and whatnot. So he kind of gives an example of various ones that have, lost various loved ones and were motivated then to improve their capital, to find ways to make more profit, so that I guess like following into like funding research and whatnot. But at some level, that's kind of an argument against what the barriers are. If you're already motivated prior, like if you were motivated because your loved one, there needed to be more research to save their lives and whatnot, you shouldn't have to enter into a highly competitive capitalistic system to then fund money, to then fund research. It doesn't seem as though the incentive is just to make a profit. It's that the barrier for where you're already motivated to desire for the research, and other people would be motivated as well. There's barriers to it because you first need to have this incredible capitalistic gains in order to even get the conversation going. And so at some level, some things like universal values for humans and research and whatnot, as pertaining to healthcare and whatnot, seem to not be among the best situation when it's just capitalistic profit motivated. There just seems to be incentives for people to want quality of life for their loved ones without having to have the excessive barriers for competing on massive scales for capitalistic gains just to try to save the lives of their loved ones. And it, like I said, though, it goes into all of these other conversations having to do with healthcare, which is a whole other side note, which is a whole other conversation as to transparency and costs and what motivate. Like, it just seems like healthcare is really morphed into this capitalistic heights and barriers of costs and barriers for who's already motivated for research and better quality of life. And so there actually are capitalistic barriers getting in the way of people just having that motivation. I don't know. I would have to go through more of like a direct conversation in terms of health care and not just kind of get on one right now. I guess, though, to say quickly, though, I do think that there's some factors within the rat race of the capitalistic engine and the barriers that it can create are actually produce more of the health issues that then the market then profits off of. And so there's a lot of factors in terms of just the health and well-being of our societies and whatnot. And I think a lot of that, just like a side note, is the pace of life and the excessiveness for like we're talking about incentive or motivation, the motivation to be recruited at such a high level to play the game of a high stakes capitalistic form then makes it so that you have to play at that high level and make ends meet or, like profit at a high level to keep the pace, to pay for the difference of the cost of it on your health, on your life, on the pace of life, and to set that pace all the way down for other people caught up in this system, then doesn't really speak to those that, like at a base level that want to live a simple life, a simple, sustainable life. It doesn't really speak against them as not having a quality standard and discipline of their life. It just means that these high stakes capitalistic gains have influence to people all the way down to the point where some motivating factor is you're recruited into having to play this high stake profit game. Otherwise, your loved ones can suffer. And that's what we also see affecting the world. And anyway, so just kind of a quick note. So they're still talking about incentive. And so it's kind of gotten to the point making reference to various ones having a passion or driven by a certain passion as to why they want to involve themselves in certain projects or efforts and whatnot. And he is making reference to the notion that there has to be a profit incentive or connecting that passion to wanting to make a certain profit. And he had previously asked various ones like who had they created jobs for and whatnot. And so it's not, when you think about it, it's not really the question as to whether or not something that you're passionate about can make a profit. And then from that profit, you can incorporate other groups to participate in it. And then they also make a profit connected to your work of passion and whatnot. I think some of the question is when you kind of get it backwards and just assuming that the desire incentive to make a profit and then to recruit people that can also make a profit in and of itself is some type of grand gesture or proper criteria or motivating factor. There's a difference between attaching internal passion and desire, of which a lot of times people would still do, even, if it's just their truth that they're living and they're passionate about it, even if it wasn't making an incredible profit. Of course, there would be that desire for it to have more of a profit, which would mean that the system is responding to those efforts and work. But the idea of a profit doesn't really reflect on whether or not there really is a true motivation and passion and a truth to it in reference to a potential connection to a systemic opportunity. And then from there, the opportunity to recruit more people to be a part of it. It just also is the question of when there's a system where the motivation is simply to make a profit and then recruit people to make more of a profit. Yes, you can do that. I mean, you see that with stuff like OnlyFans and whatnot. People do it because they're put into a position where they want to make a profit. And once they make a profit, they can recruit other people to make a profit as well. Does it mean that it's driven by an innate desire of their ultimate life passion? And so I think that's what is a difference between a system by which produces a result to make to recruit people to then participate in making a profit, and then it connects a network of people making a profit, is different than a system where people have a connection to their life passion and don't always make that same type of profit. This isn't to say, I think also a reminder is we're talking about on the grand scale of a morphing, powerful system. We're not talking about, like the small business owner and whatnot that definitely does have their interest and passion connected to creating their business and then creating jobs and recruiting people to participate in that vision. Of course, you can see the freedom to be able to do that, but you also see major corporations and companies also hindering those abilities as well, which then there's conversations that go along with that as well. We are at claim number 2, which is his claim that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system. On this topic, something that seems in practice to be functioning is that in the midst of the world influence and power of this capitalistic country where there's like the uber rich, it actually seems that some of what has produced the ability to select for the personal freedoms that people are attracted to in the country comes from the safety nets that have been connected to the system, so that it can function through over time can select for your individual hope for growth over time. So basically what I'm saying is it's some of the safety nets that have been attached to these massive systems that help people to be lifted out of poverty as it creates or produces these corrective measures onto this massive aspect of the system. Weren't for some of the safety nets that were being attached to it, of which helped to develop integration, then over time it likely would have produced an even more closed system. And so it's these attached social safety nets that seem to have refined over time internally what the standards of capitalism and the benefits of it are. I mean, a capitalist might even say, well, that's because of the free market mechanism attached to it. But I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't function as well without the social safety net attached to it, of which is actually doing a lot of the work too, as to lift people out of poverty and whatnot. It seems like, since it makes reference to single mothers, well, because people keep bringing it up a lot, it kind of seems as though, well, I did kind of talk about this before, even just single parents in general, but kind of the question of actually incentivizes people to be able to look at their own individual responsibilities and grow within the disciplines of those measures. The language that he seems to be making reference to is that it's more of another form of penalizing groups for not adhering to a certain type of adherence to a certain family formation. And so it seems as though at some level there's this interpretive lens that the capitalistic approach is a type of corrective measure or some form of a corrective measure to implement or to integrate or to achieve that level of like a corrective control measure. And in that people are not abiding within that standard, then there's some type of like assuming some kind of like systemic like penalty, I suppose you would say. And so it seems like this talking point of a type of like being penalized by the system for not adhering to a certain type of approach to family, as opposed to like the question of why wouldn't the system incentivize just like personal responsibilities for different ones. Seems like a roundabout way of saying that built within the system is this control measure that you adhere to it, or there's these certain penalties of that. That's not to say, I mean, that kind of gets into, he starts making reference to like entitlement programs and the feminist movements and things along those lines. I do think at some level there could be various effects of incentives within systems that can select for certain behavioral dynamics. I'm not denying that, while at the same time, I still tend to think there is better standard with just simply encouraging people to be the best, more disciplined standard of success for them as a person, and included within that the disciplines of taking on your responsibilities and a system by which selects for that, as opposed to built in to a system this like a high profit motivation to have a control mechanism over family functions and whatnot. I just don't think that that's a attribute of selecting for those like innate or more of like the internal effect of love and relationship and things along those lines. If it gets away from this idea of love and relationship as pertaining to families from your personal to collective approach, and it just gets into like control measures of selecting for what it should be, then it just seems like another repeat, as I was saying before. I already kind of talked about this, a control measure of what a certain family function should look like. And it just seems like since the ancient of times, that's been a mechanism built into a lot of systems, and then motivates people to play to that as duplicating the preservation of it and seeing it as a market value unto the family once again, as opposed to the risk of what it is to give people individual human rights. And then they don't have to motivate them with these other incentives to like weaponize against certain controlled measure groups, whether it be families or whatnot. Just allowing the individual rights then to also be incorporated within practices of loving family units and groups, or people that work together to partner for the development of their lives. When it's built into pre-selecting what that unit would look like, then it seems to get into, in the long run, these market competitive values of controlling favor over various groups. I had said something earlier that I don't necessarily disagree with. I'll have to think about it some more when he talked about looking at other countries. I believe he made reference to Japan and China, I believe it was. And he talked about getting away from, so like to develop increase in certain market value and profit, to break up the like centralized banks or the control over, say, like one bank, and then implement various banks so that there is more of a competitive market. There does seem to be something there. There does seem to be, something in terms of breaking up a more centralized control mechanism and then allowing there to be numerous more options, which then create a market for various ones to adjust their prices because they don't have ultimate control. There does seem to be something along those lines that can help to, through certain types of having an increase of opportunity and access for selecting for people to, through their participation in choosing within the market, to then refine what those entities, whether it be these banks, offer various ones. So they participate in having the ability to form and refine those opportunities. So I can kind of see maybe along those lines what he's getting at in terms of some portions of breaking up the centralized control allow for the betterment of giving people the opportunity to participate, to be the refining mechanism. But that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of some forms that's enacted within capitalistic control measures is, and that's kind of what we're saying about relationships as well, is if there's a certain standard, if you're saying communism is the only one that would have like a control standard of, say, like a bank, and then in breaking it up and giving people more opportunity refines the ability for the market in relation to interactions of human behavior. Isn't that kind of what we're saying, though, in the sense of the family dynamic not also being a control mechanism like a centered bank, and allowing it to be more of the freedom of personal decision to select for the disciplines and the mechanisms of people then to choose the types of partnerships by which they will develop trusting relationships or connections in order to participate. At some level, it seems like it's kind of getting around just looking at human behavior in different types of ways. So along this line, they're talking about the massive amount, like Patrick is making reference to the massive amount of what he says, like entitlement programs like welfare and such, paying into those, and like the massive amount. But we talked about this in recent days, where if you look at the budget of like the cost for continual forever wars, as people make mention of, the cost of forever wars, which then does have economic value. Well, the payment that it costs various ones to pay into forever wars, which then becomes this mechanism attached directly to how some of the portions of the ideas associated with selecting for a type of capitalistic gain in relation to these wars, conflicts, and whatnot, in relation to the types of partners geopolitically that are associated with the incentive to buy into these forever wars, is actually seeming to be in direct connection to the types of entitlement programs within the system, which seem to generate this issue, or this like instability, and also is connected to the geopolitical war system and whatnot. That's not to say that I'm looking, or that I'm making reference to some type of utopian world of which that never seems to be a factor, or that we don't have to look at defense funding and whatnot, or defense budgets. But it is also just seems to be in direct connection to the type of selection of what type of capitalism is functioning there, and how, if you're looking at the effects on entitlement programs and whatnot, a huge entitlement program is the budget that goes toward funding these forever wars to other nations that are not even a part of our country, of which then affects why other groups and other nations have that destabilizing, and why they then have to come and integrate into the U.S. to have a voice to speak on behalf of their nation and their country. And so when you look at the interconnection of the economy, it just seems to go all the way down geopolitically. And so yeah, a massive entitlement program seems to be the funding of these like continuous wars and whatnot, and then it has ripple effects into our domestic approach and seemingly intentional destabilizing domestically within our country, unless we are willing to be motivated or recruited into the capitalistic gains, which also fund those measures. And so it's just different types of looking at the selection of entitlement and whatnot. And even like the welfare question, though, that goes into a lot of other discussions on looking at private property. I talked about this on other videos, looking at private property and the programs and undergirding by which people had begun having their gains within private property and allocations of land to then build and develop on, and incentivize to then defend certain selective measures of interpretation of the system, and selective measures pertaining to what's attached to the private property gains and whatnot. So just another one of those ideas all the way down. I guess you would say there's certain selective ideas associated with certain versions of capitalism, and so the question is it really functioning in the way that it could otherwise be? Could it be refined even more outside of these selective ideas? Just to kind of wrap up this section of the question about relief from poverty, and then the previous one, the incentive or motivating factors, it kind of reminds me of, so here's the thing, I'm not saying that he didn't develop his life and improve his life and whatnot, and that there weren't factors where he could, involve himself in order to do that, and that there, I'm not denying that there, there isn't some level of success to it. It's just that it's kind of this question that there's other connections within the capitalistic selecting mechanism that could probably be refined and then still account for what he's saying is some of the benefits of a more free market and stuff like that. And also incorporating the benefits of the safety net to integrate people at some level, because of these other forces and whatnot. But I also just was thinking, it reminds me of this one movie. I think it's called The Bronx Tale. I forget exactly. It's been a while since I watched it. But there's this little boy that's kind of watching. He's kind of growing up and watching the streets, and some of the mobsters, right? And the mobsters are really wealthy. They have their fancy cars, and he kind of sees them down the street and their various interactions. And you could see he's kind of playing to the idea of seeing the stars in his eyes and their lifestyle and whatnot. And at one point, his dad, who's a hardworking father, is telling him, stay away from there, because he finds him kind of going down there. He says, you stay away from them and don't get involved in that lifestyle, or what have you. And then he's finds out that he's getting money from them because they incorporate him into their world and ask him to deliver some stuff, or what have you. Anyway, the dad finds the money and he says, where did you get this? Where'd you get this? And then he brings it over to them and gives the money back to them. And then he's upset with his dad. And he's saying something like, why'd you do that? That was my money. That was my money. And then he's like, don't you ever, don't you mess with them. You stay away, da-da-da-da-da. So then it's this whole part of the story. And then they're leaving the bar, right, where the mobsters are doing their business. And he's bringing his son out. And his son's like, why'd you do that? That was my money. I earned that money. He's like, you stay away from them, da-da-da-da-da. And he's like, you made more money than I make in, I don't know, such and such or whatever. And then he's kind of just like, what's wrong with that? He's like, I work hard for what I do, da 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 da. So it's kind of this whole idea of the hardworking man that is building his life for his family with integrity, and he doesn't always get the rewards from some of the other excesses of the system and whatnot. And there's other things that coincide with the benefits of that system. And then he says, basically, I'm a working man, da 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 da. And he's like, the working man, the boy says, the working man is a sucker. And so it's this whole very theatrical conversation, and it kind of paints this picture of hard work and integrity that doesn't always get you the benefits of all the excesses and whatnot. And so and I don't think that that's what Patrick is talking about. Patrick seems to come across as someone that tries to have integrity in what he does and tries to follow the protocol of working these various jobs, like he said, and then building up and then being motivated to want to do better and better and better. And then having certain mechanisms to be able to do that and to reward that. And I see that that's what it seems like he's talking about. But the inference that I'm making here in connection to the mobsters, and it's a good movie, you should watch it. There's a lot of like behavioral dynamics you can kind of follow in the movie, and obstacles and whatnot. But it does kind of portray those, what I'm saying is some aspects built into mechanisms of the capitalistic system are kind of like the mobster system. You know, we kind of are like the mobster system on the world stage. And then the question is, if you're arguing for some of the better incentives of the capitalistic gains, does it require still having the mobster mentality, or can this function without it? And so we're looking at the the world stage, and like we were saying, like the main entitlement program, which is like the forever wars and the funding of those geopolitical gains, and does it have to be that way? And there are certain ideologies attached to that, which then are protected within who can or cannot gain from the capitalistic program. And so it's starting to come out more and more that the capitalistic program has attached itself to those types of maneuvers or control measures. So that's kind of what I'm making reference to. So I think now we're moving on to another point that he's making. Next point that he's making is that if all the money were divided equally, it would return to the same pockets within like a certain amount of years. I guess my initial response to this point would be, and I'm not trying to just pick on OnlyFans and whatnot, but it just serves as like a well-known example, right? He could also make that argument as to even if they like took all the money away from OnlyFans and blocked it and then distributed it into the population and then reopened OnlyFans, then it would return to those same numbers and measures within 5 years. And so you can even argue that point with those types of industries and whatnot. And it doesn't mean that it's because it's like a supreme moral system. It's also just because the effects, a lot of people will say they get involved in, one of the main motivating factors of getting involved in OnlyFans isn't because it's like their greatest dream or passion as much as the society we live in selects for those types of measures for people to make money. And then over time, they do make these excessive amounts of money, and it just kind of generates that type of world involvement and whatnot. Some can make the argument, though, that the reason for that, though, functioning through a capitalistic society is that it selects for people's like innate desires, and it's a function of the market. It's because people actually want those things. But at the same time, it's also a function of the enclosures of this system to not allow other approaches or methods of incorporation, possibly. Because women get involved in those types, mostly the market is for women that have to do other things in order to generate some type of income because they're put in that position because of some of the enclosures of the system, which select for those behaviors. And then some of the market of men, because they're caught in this rat race, it tends to seem to be a quick type of escapism mechanism because of the factors of the system. So all things being the same, if the money was distributed and the system was the same, it would tend to recreate the same type of outcome and function. But that doesn't mean that the system is necessarily successful. I think what he's getting to, though, is that people are mismanaging their money. Those that have money are in those positions because they're involving themselves in the system, and then they're gaining the wealth of the system. And then those that don't have the wealth of the system is because they're not managing their money appropriately. To some degree, that can happen. There are certain motivating factors to be involved in advocating for the growth and stability of your life. But there's also arguments as to certain actions that are full of integrity and proper standards and passion and whatnot don't always get the favor benefits of the system and whatnot. I guess, like, way to look at it. So I don't exactly disagree with everything he's saying. I do think there is some level of, in the midst of it, there are some that over the long haul, if they stand with discipline and integrity and wanting to integrate change in their life, there is something within just the mechanisms of life where it does seem to have a reward over time to live within disciplines of life and whatnot. That doesn't mean, though, that it exactly fits with the mechanism of the system that we find ourselves in, or that the system doesn't need to be improved or refined or whatnot. One of the motivating factors or like demotivating factors in the system is that there's certain control mechanisms, or if you want to say propaganda or attachments to the system and how it functions, are also what demotivate people from wanting to be involved in it, because their involvement then justifies those claims. And so if you were able to decouple some portions of the benefits that people argue for a type of capitalism or free market, and it's separated from these other attachments, that could also be a different type of motivating factor. And so basically what I'm getting at is a human behavioral dynamic is that if something seems to represent people better, a lot of times it'll motivate them to integrate into the system in a different way, to invest in it, to be motivated because it speaks on behalf of them as they become involved in it. It becomes a clearer picture of their involvement and attribute of life and what they stand for. So you can't just say that some of the demotivating factors or what have you are simply because of a lack of, basically a lack of not wanting to be involved in managing your money or bettering it. It's that some of the attachments are what seem to draw out that motivation. I don't feel like I have said that. I don't feel like I said that as clearly as what I would like to. Basically, like in the very basic level, if you have a recruitment leader and the people are inspired for the vision, they're going to want to participate in that vision. They're going to want to change and be motivated and invest in it, whether it be with their passion, with their money, with what have you. If it represents them, if it speaks to the integrity of their humanity and whatnot. In that, people don't always seem motivated to want to justify or solidify the claims of a system. It doesn't mean that they're not motivated intrinsically in other situations to want to do that. It could also mean they don't want to justify what they deem an improper package deal of a system. And so that also could be a factor in inhibiting people's, not wanting to participate in the package deal of success of something that seems to be a slight against their humanity. This is why people are also trying to make the argument as to it does matter. It isn't just taking any offer that you're given. It's looking at what's the mind and the ideals and the ideologies behind what you're, getting people to be involved in with their money, and not just the profit on its own, but what it asks of you as a human being, what it, in practice, then causes you to seem to adhere to and whatnot. I think at some level, as they continue in the conversation with this question of like motivate or, like managing money and whatnot, I do think at some level there is something to the growth that people have as they experience their life and the aspect of money or ability to participate in life in terms of economic abilities and whatnot. There is a various dynamic where you grow into learning to manage money and opportunities and try to make the most of your situation. There is that degree. So I'm not saying that there isn't any of that. But I think when we're looking at these massive systems and whatnot, it's difficult to become motivated to, I think at some level what people are getting to when they talk about socialism and whatnot is that it also comes back to resources and whatnot, and looking at the global network and the growth mechanism. There are times where we can look at what's sellable, how to make a profit, But I also think what kind of undergirds this conversation is that in the whole grand scheme of things, looking at the climate, sustainability, resources, is just shifting from that mindset of, as pertaining to the way we even look at jobs. Because even now when I hear someone say, you can be a businessman, you can do this, you can do that, you can sell medical advice, this, that, the other. I think at some level, I think young people in the world and various ones are just looking at, we can't continue to just generate sales and continuous sales. I think we're trying to figure out how do we look at the world in sustainability and meeting our societal needs now that we just can't continue to compete for making the best sales or manufacturing a type of sale. I think people are continually motivated to try to sell the next thing or be the salesperson at the door, even if they could. I mean, I understand that people have to do that at some level or stage in their life, but then you start shifting into like looking at what is sustainable or for healthy living and whatnot, not just a profit. So his final claim is the U.S. is more socialist than capitalist today. If you hate the system, you're anti-socialist. I guess pertaining to this point, it probably requires me to somewhat reiterate what I talked about in another video when it was attempting to start defining terms between, like what people mean by socialist. And so for me, a democratic socialist approach is probably different than, there's variations out there. But for me, what I see it as is I'm not trying to entirely destroy private property. I am wanting to look at refining what that means and what's attached itself to the ideas of private property. Like in terms of propagandist type war, conflict and whatnot, in terms of certain measures that are funded to incorporate the defense of private property and enclosures. But I'm not entirely against the idea of other corrective measures to private property and looking at what that means and the standards by which enforce it. And then some of the aspects of capitalism as pertaining to different stages of growth and reward and market and societal stages of like implementing different degrees of education and services and whatnot. I think that even in a society where there's a sense of fair, equitable, meeting basic human needs, there's going to be nuance of stages of growth and various needs at stages and seasons of life, different stages of leadership and integration and transference of education and whatnot. And along those lines, if you're looking at growth, among other things within capitalism, I'm still willing to entertain those ideas. And so when I look at the idea of democratic socialism, I tend to see it as a mechanism that's implemented to try to prevent the worst parts of improper capitalistic gains that create massive wealth for various groups, and then through that manufacture improper scarcity, like we see in a warfare machine, like we see in property enclosures tied to a defense mechanism that is an entitlement for continual warfare and expansion, and not really implementing the better measures of domestic stability and allowing for more of the freedoms to let the market, in better terms, like formulate growth measures among populations and whatnot. And so I see the socialist aspect as integrating safety nets to prevent the worst of the worst, to help to integrate. So that's kind of how I see it, as integration into the system to be an internal mechanism of change and shift where those enclosures are enacted. Because the massive system is the driving force of that, then it seems as though the socialist aspect of integration is not the driving force of it, but is kind of following through to kind of keep some type of integration pace. And so I don't really look at the capitalistic version or the socialist corrective measure that kind of has to follow along with it as the ideal for either version. And so you would think that some measures of the social safety net, or even just the baseline integration of populations and preservation and like representation of basic human needs, is able to function. I think it has, like in the more basic ideals, it also tends to follow in with this morphing and keeping the pace of the morphed capitalistic gains. And so there does seem to be some type of function where the measures, like the corrective measures that are seeking to be implemented into capitalism, and there are groups that are seeking to integrate both of those, still having a hard time because it kind of goes into other factors. Like at the very basic level, housing is expensive, and some of these other factors that are influenced all the way down. Involved in it just seems to be the battleground for maintaining these certain types of like enclosures that we're seeing. And I think that's where people are both trying to preserve the betterment of what our country stands for, because there are a lot of good things involved in this whole struggle that we've all been involved in. But I think at the same time, when people are making those references, they just see the responsibility that we have in the U.S. to speak on behalf of what's going on, internationally. And so I think that's where, some of the frustration is wanting to preserve the betterment, and still seeming captured within some of these control measures. And then it makes reference, or it becomes apparent within the state that we find ourselves. Anyway, in speaking to the point that he was making, though, it seems like it still is being influenced at, like in a major standard from capitalistic investment in relation to some of the other control mechanisms. And even in that sense, it's not, maybe people are saying, well, the capitalists aren't really able to portray the more accurate ideals of what their argument is, and so they might say because of socialism or whatnot. But maybe a different type of socialism, in the sense of like some of these other entities that have attached at the higher levels geopolitically and whatnot, but not really the socialism that works on creating a safety net domestically for people. Kind of wrapping up the conversation where he chooses someone to have more of a prolonged debate with, one-on-one instead of the group interaction. And they're talking about meritocracy and whatnot. But I feel like I've already kind of made my point along those lines in terms of, I think so they were kind of going back and forth as to whether we do live in a meritocracy, or, like merit is rewarded and whatnot. And Patrick then seemed to kind of frame it as though likening it to, or wondering if what he was talking about was if those that had started out with more have more favor in terms of outcomes and benefits and whatnot. And there is something to that. I mean, there is some effect on where you start, but there also are stories where no matter where you start from, people can still be resilient and whatnot. But I don't think it's so much just that, as much as some of the mechanisms within the system reward those that agree with it. And if you're not wanting to agree with it, then there seems to be some type of mechanism of punishment. And so there is there is within the system a type of selecting for certain forms of additional agreements that are rewarded. And so, maybe some of the question is that certain types of integrity and truth are not always rewarded as much as adherence to whatever is incorporated within the system framework is and being in agreement with it is what is rewarded. They kind of end their conversation talking about Social Security and things along those lines, but I think I'm just going to leave it at that. It was just kind of like an end note conversation. And so anyway, that's basically the summary and some commentary pertaining to the video.